There comes a time in every woman's life when the world tells her she no longer matters. At 57, Elira knows this feeling well as she watches younger women prepare for the village's most important night. In the mountain village of Thornvale, the blood bonding ritual happens once a year. Young women are chosen to be paired with vampire lords to keep peace between their worlds. But Elira sits alone in her small cottage. The village council says she's too old and too plain to participate. While everyone gathers for the ceremony, she tends her herbs and accepts her place as forgotten. High above in his dark castle, the alpha vampire king looks down at the celebration. He counts the faces, remembering each woman from years past. Then he realizes someone is missing, a healer who once showed him unexpected kindness when he needed it most. But why would an immortal king remember one ordinary woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound Village Chronicle sat open on the wooden table in Thornvale's meeting hall, its yellowed pages filled with 3 centuries of careful script. Each entry recorded the same sacred ritual, young women's names paired with vampire lords, dates of bonding, and the peace that followed. But if someone were to search those pages for the name Elira Ashwood, they would find nothing. Not once in her 57 years had her name graced those hallowed records. Elira's fingers worked steadily through the dried chamomile, separating petals from stems with the practiced ease of 4 decades spent healing others. Her cottage, nestled at the edge of Thornvale where the cobblestone streets gave way to wild meadows, bore the comfortable wear of a life lived in service. Bundles of herbs hung from every beam, filling the air with the earthy scents of lavender, sage, and rosemary. Clay pots lined the windowsills, each containing remedies she'd perfected over years of tending to scraped knees, difficult births, and the aches that come with growing old in a mountain village. The Blackwood Mountains rose beyond her garden like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist, even on clear days. Local children whispered that the mountains held secrets older than memory, but Elira found comfort in their steady presence. They had watched over her grandmother, her mother, and now her 3 generations of women who understood that healing required both herb and heart. In the village center, preparations for tonight's blood-bonding ritual had begun before dawn. Young women moved through the streets wearing their finest gowns, their hair adorned with flowers that would be blessed by the village priest. Their mothers fussed over every detail, while fathers stood by with expressions mixing pride and worry. The ritual was both honor and sacrifice. Chosen daughters would leave Thornvale forever, bound to vampire lords in marriages that secured peace between the mortal and immortal realms. Elira remembered her own mother's disappointment when no vampire lord had chosen her all those years ago. Perhaps next year, they'd said, when she was 18, then 19, then 20. By 25, the whispers had grown cruel. Too plain, the village women murmured behind their hands. Too quiet. What vampire lord wants a wife who speaks only of herbs and healing? The hurt had faded decades ago, replaced by the deeper understanding that comes with experience. She'd married Thomas Ashwood when she was 28, a kind blacksmith who saw worth where others saw lack. For 15 years they'd built a life together, his strong hands complementing her gentle ones. He died in the fever outbreak that took half the village's men, leaving her a widow at 43 with no children to carry on their name. Now, at 57, her hair had turned silver at the temples, and lines mapped the corners of her eyes, evidence of countless hours spent by sickbeds, offering comfort when healing wasn't possible. The young women who would participate in tonight's ritual called her Aunt Elira with genuine affection, seeking her remedies for nervous stomachs and restless sleep. Yet none would think to include her among their number. A knock at her door interrupted her work. Old Mrs. Henwick stood on the threshold, leaning heavily on her walking stick, her weathered face creased with pain. "My joints are acting up again, dear. the elderly woman said, settling into the chair Elira kept ready for visitors. "The damp air from the mountain seems to settle right into my bones." Elira moved to her shelves, selecting a jar of salve made from wintergreen and willow bark. "Apply this morning and evening," she instructed, pressing the remedy into Mrs. Henwick's gnarled hands. "And drink willow bark tea twice daily. The pain should ease within a few days." "You're a blessing, child," Mrs. Henwick said, though she was only a decade older than Elira. "Don't know what we'd do without you. Are you planning to watch the ceremony tonight?" Elira shook her head gently. "I think I'll tend my garden instead. The autumn herbs need harvesting before the first frost." Mrs. Henwick's expression softened with understanding. They both knew why Elira wouldn't attend. The unspoken truth hung between them like the mountain mist. Some women were meant to watch from the margins, while others stepped into destinies written by forces beyond their control. As evening approached, the village transformed. Lanterns hung from every doorway, their warm light casting dancing shadows on the cobblestones. The great hall, usually reserved for harvest celebrations and weddings, had been adorned with tapestries depicting the first blood-bonding ceremony 300 years ago. According to legend, the ritual had ended a war that nearly destroyed both vampire and human populations in the mountain region. From her window, Elira could see the chosen women gathering in the village square. 7 this year, the same number as always, representing the 7 noble houses of the vampire court. They wore gowns of deep crimson, the color of the bonds they would soon share with their immortal partners. Each carried a silver chalice, a family heirloom that would be filled with blessed wine during the ceremony. The village council members stood in their ceremonial robes, their faces solemn with the weight of tradition. Mayor Hartwell, a man whose belly had grown as round as his self-importance over the years, gestured grandly as he instructed the participants. Beside him, Councilwoman Briggs pursed her lips in perpetual disapproval, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "The healer won't be joining us," Elira heard Councilwoman Briggs say to Mayor Hartwell, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Just as well. We need women who can represent our village with dignity, not someone who spends her days grubbing about with herbs and tending to the common folks' complaints." Elira turned away from the window, the casual cruelty stinging less than it once might have. She'd learned long ago that some people measured worth by visibility rather than service, by youth rather than wisdom. Let them have their ceremonies and grand gestures. She would do what she'd always done, care for those who needed caring, heal what could be healed, and find purpose in the quiet moments between heartbreak and hope. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the mountain walls as the vampire delegation arrived. Even from her cottage, Elira could sense the change in the air, a subtle shift that spoke of power older than the stones beneath their feet. The vampires rode horses black as midnight, their riders cloaked in shadows that seemed to move independent of the wind. At their head rode a figure that commanded attention without seeking it. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the ease of centuries spent in the saddle. This was Lord Aldrich, the Alpha Vampire King, though few in Thornvale had seen him up close. He typically sent representatives to handle the ritual while he remained in his castle, overseeing matters of greater import to his immortal court. But tonight was different. Tonight he'd come himself. Elira closed her curtains and returned to her herbs, seeking solace in familiar routines. The ceremony would proceed as it had for 300 years. Young women would be paired with vampire lords, vows would be exchanged, and the delicate balance between 2 worlds would be maintained for another year. Her absence would be noted by no one except perhaps Mrs. Henwick, who understood the particular loneliness of being overlooked. As the village bells began to chime, marking the start of the ritual, Elira lit a candle and opened her grandmother's journal. The pages contained not only recipes for healing salves and tinctures, but also stories of women who'd found their worth in service rather than ceremony. Tonight, while others celebrated tradition, she would honor the legacy of healers who'd come before her, women whose names might not appear in official chronicles, but whose gentle hands had touched countless lives. In the distance, she could hear the ceremonial drums and the low chanting of ancient words. The blood bonding had begun, another chapter in the long story of peace between mortal and immortal. But in her small cottage at the edge of Thornvale, Elira Ashwood continued her own quiet work, unaware that her absence would soon change everything. The ceremonial drums reached their crescendo as 7 young women stepped forward in the great hall, their crimson gowns flowing like liquid fire in the candlelight. Each held aloft a silver chalice, some ornate family heirlooms, others simpler vessels, blessed by generations of use. The moonstone chalice, traditionally reserved for the eldest daughter of the founding families, bore a hairline crack down its side from a ceremony decades past, yet it still held its place of honor. Mayor Hartwell's voice boomed across the assembled crowd. Let it be known that these 7 daughters of Thornvale step forward willingly, chosen for their virtue, their beauty, and their worthiness to bind our 2 realms in sacred alliance. His eyes swept the crowd with satisfaction before settling on the vampire lords who stood waiting in the shadows. From her cottage window, Elira caught glimpses of the ceremony through the gaps between buildings. She'd closed her curtains but found herself drawn back to the glass, watching the pageantry that had excluded her once again. The rational part of her mind accepted this reality. She was past the age of such things, her hair silver where it should be gold, her hands calloused from work rather than soft from leisure. A sharp rap at her door pulled her from the window. Mrs. Henwick stood there again, but this time she was bent double, clutching her chest. "Elira, dear, I can barely breathe," the old woman gasped. "Started just after I got home from seeing you earlier." Elira ushered her inside quickly, helping her to the chair by the fire. "Mrs." Henwick's lips had a bluish tinge that sent alarm through Elira's practiced eye. "Heart trouble. Something the willow bark couldn't touch. When did this start?" Elira asked, already moving to her shelves for foxglove and hawthorn. "Right after I climbed the stairs to my loft, Mrs." Henwick wheezed. "Felt like someone was sitting on my chest." Elira worked swiftly, preparing a tincture that would ease the strain on the elderly woman's heart. Outside, she could hear Councilwoman Briggs's sharp voice carrying over the crowd. "The healer's absence tonight is noted and approved. We present only our finest to our immortal allies." The words stung, but Elira pushed them aside. Mrs. Henwick needed her attention, and that mattered more than any ceremony. As she helped the old woman sip the bitter medicine, she reflected on how often she'd missed village celebrations to tend to someone in need. It was a choice she'd made long ago to be present for pain rather than pageantry. "You're an angel, Mrs." Henwick murmured as her breathing began to ease. "Don't know what would have happened if you'd gone to watch the bonding like the rest of them." "Someone needs to be here for the living," Elira said gently, settling a blanket around the old woman's shoulders. "The ceremony will proceed just fine without me." But even as she spoke those words, something was stirring in the great hall that would prove her wrong. Lord Aldrich stood among his fellow vampire lords, his dark eyes scanning the 7 young women presented for bonding. 3 centuries of this ritual had taught him to read faces, to see beyond surface beauty to the character beneath. These women were lovely, certainly, and well prepared for their roles, yet something felt incomplete about the gathering. He was ancient even by vampire standards, having ruled for over 600 years. The blood-bonding ritual had begun during his reign as a desperate measure to end a war that threatened to destroy both their peoples. What had started as political necessity had evolved into sacred tradition, but lately he found himself going through the motions without feeling their meaning. As Mayor Hartwell droned through the ceremonial introductions, Aldrich's mind wandered to a memory from decades past. He'd been wounded badly during a territorial dispute with a rival clan. Too proud to seek help from his own court, he'd collapsed in the woods outside Thornvale, his immortal healing slowed by silver poisoning. A woman had found him there, hidden among the fallen leaves. Not young, even then, with gentle hands and no fear in her eyes, despite finding a vampire lord bleeding in her path. She'd helped him to her cottage, tended his wounds with herbs that eased the silver's burn, and asked for nothing in return. "Your name?" he'd asked, as consciousness returned. "Elira," she'd said simply, pressing a cool cloth to his fevered brow. "Rest now. The healing takes time." He'd left before dawn, wanting to spare her any connection to vampire politics. But her kindness had stayed with him through the years, a moment of pure compassion in a life defined by power and ceremony. Now, as he counted the 7 women before him, that memory surfaced with startling clarity. Where was the healer? In all his years attending these rituals, she'd never been among the chosen, but she'd always been present in the crowd. Her absence struck him like a discordant note in familiar music. "My lord," Mayor Hartwell's voice cut through his reverie, "if you would choose your bonding partner for this year's ceremony." Aldrich's gaze moved over the 7 young faces, each hopeful and nervous in equal measure. They were prepared for this moment, trained from childhood to be worthy partners for vampire lords. Yet the absence of one woman, a healer who'd shown him mercy when he needed it most, suddenly made the entire ceremony feel hollow. "I require a moment," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. The hall fell silent at his words. Alpha vampire kings did not ask for moments. They decided, they commanded, they moved forward without hesitation. But Aldrich found himself thinking of gentle hands and herb-scented rooms, of a woman who'd treated him as simply a creature in need of healing, rather than a lord to be feared or flattered. When had he last encountered such genuine care? When had anyone looked at him and seen past the crown to the being beneath? "My lord, is something amiss?" Councilwoman Briggs asked, her tone carefully respectful but edged with concern. A delayed ceremony could upset delicate political balances. Aldrich straightened, decision crystallizing with the weight of command. "Where is the healer?" The question fell into the assembled crowd like a stone into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the gathering. The 7 chosen women exchanged glances, unsure whether they'd somehow failed in their presentation. "My lord?" Mayor Hartwell's face had gone pale. "The village healer," Aldrich clarified, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. "Elira Ashwood. Why is she not present?" Councilwoman Briggs stepped forward, her expression tight with disapproval. "My lord, the healer was not chosen for this year's ceremony. She is past the appropriate age for such honors." "Past the appropriate age," Aldrich repeated slowly, as if tasting foreign words. "And who determined what age is appropriate for honoring those who serve?" The silence stretched uncomfortable and long. In her cottage at the village's edge, Elira was helping Mrs. Henwick settle into the chair by the fire, unaware that her name had just been spoken in tones that could reshape kingdoms. She spooned honey into chamomile tea, her movements economical and sure, focused entirely on the needs of the woman before her. "Perhaps," Councilwoman Briggs said carefully, "my lord would prefer to proceed with the chosen candidates. They have been prepared extensively for this honor." Aldrich looked once more at the 7 young women, then at the assembled crowd of villagers, whose faces reflected generations of tradition. The blood-bonding ritual had always been about peace between their peoples, but when had it become about youth and beauty rather than wisdom and worth? "Postpone the ceremony," he commanded, his voice cutting through the great hall like a blade through silk. The gathered crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Never in 300 years had a blood-bonding ceremony been postponed. The vampire lords accompanying Aldrich exchanged meaningful glances, while the village council looked as though the world had shifted beneath their feet. "My lord," Mayor Hartwell stammered, "surely we can resolve whatever concerns you. Have without." "The ceremony is postponed," Aldrich repeated, his tone allowing no argument, "until I have spoken with the healer." He turned and strode from the great hall, leaving chaos in his wake. The 7 young women stood in their crimson gowns, confusion and disappointment warring in their expressions. The village council huddled in urgent whispers, trying to understand how their carefully planned evening had unraveled, with a few simple questions about an overlooked healer. Outside, Aldrich mounted his black stallion and turned toward the edge of town, where lamplight glowed warmly in a small cottage window. After decades of ceremony and political alliance, he found himself riding toward the one place in Thornvale where he'd once been treated not as a king, but simply as someone in need of healing. Behind him, the great hall buzzed with uncertainty and whispered theories. But in her quiet cottage, Elira continued her work, unaware that everything was about to change. The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestone cut through the evening air like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Elira looked up from Mrs. Henwick's bedside, her brow furrowing at the unusual disturbance. The ceremony should be in full swing by now, with no reason for anyone to be riding through the village streets. Mrs. Henwick had finally drifted into peaceful sleep, her breathing steady and deep after the heart episode. Elira adjusted the blanket around the elderly woman's shoulders and moved quietly to the window. A lone rider approached her cottage, his mount's hooves striking sparks against the stones. When the figure dismounted and stepped into the circle of light cast by her doorway lantern, Elira's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the bearing, the elegant cut of his dark coat, the way he moved with predatory grace even in stillness. This was no ordinary village visitor. The knock came soft but firm. Elira glanced back at Mrs. Henwick, ensuring she still slept soundly before opening the door. The man standing on her threshold was tall and imposing, with dark hair that caught silver in the moonlight and eyes that held the weight of centuries. The silver scar that traced across the left side of his neck, barely visible beneath his collar, confirmed what she already knew. "Lord Aldrich," she said quietly, offering a respectful curtsy despite her simple work dress and herb-stained apron. "You remember me?" His voice carried the slightest note of surprise. "Few forget an encounter with the Alpha Vampire King," Elira replied, though her tone held no fear. "Please, come in. Though I must ask you to keep your voice low, I have a patient resting." Aldrich stepped across her threshold, and Elira was struck by how the cottage seemed to shrink around his presence. He belonged in grand halls and castle chambers, not her humble kitchen with its hanging herb bundles and worn wooden furniture. "You tend the sick even during the blood-bonding ceremony," he observed, his gaze taking in Mrs. Henwick's sleeping form by the fire. "Illness doesn't respect ceremonial schedules," Elira said simply. "Mrs. Henwick had a heart episode earlier this evening. She needed care, and so you stayed with her instead of attending the ritual." Something in his tone made Elira look at him more closely. "I was not invited to attend the ritual, my lord. Perhaps you've confused me with someone else." Aldrich's dark eyes studied her face in the lamplight. She was older now than when she'd found him wounded in the forest, silver threading through hair that had once been auburn. But her eyes held the same steady compassion that had guided her hands as she'd tended his injuries all those years ago. "You were not invited," he repeated slowly. "By whose decision?" Elira moved to the kettle, more to have something to do with her hands than from any real need to prepare tea. "The village council determines who participates in the ceremony, my lord. They selected 7 worthy young women to represent Thornvale, and you were not considered worthy." The words hung between them like a challenge. Elira poured hot water over chamomile flowers, the familiar ritual steadying her nerves. "I am 57 years old, my lord, past the age where such considerations apply." "Who determined that age should be the measure of worthiness?" Elira paused in her tea preparation. There was something in his voice, not anger precisely, but a quiet intensity that suggested this conversation mattered more than mere curiosity. "It has always been thus, my lord. Young women are chosen for the blood bonding. It ensures strong alliances, and it ensures beautiful ceremonies. Aldrich interrupted. But does it ensure the right connections? She set the teapot down and turned to face him fully. I'm afraid I don't understand what you're asking. For a long moment, they looked at each other across her small kitchen. Mrs. Henwick stirred slightly in her sleep but didn't wake. The candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with jars of healing herbs. Do you remember, Aldrich said finally, finding a wounded stranger in the forest perhaps 20 years past? Elira's hands stilled on the tea service. The memory surfaced slowly, a man bleeding among the autumn leaves, silver burns marking his pale skin, proud even in his vulnerability. She'd helped him to her cottage, tended his wounds with feverfew and yarrow, never asking questions that might endanger either of them. You were hurt, she said softly, silver poisoning. You could have died if the wounds had gone untreated. Yet you helped me, a stranger who might have been dangerous. A vampire lord who could have brought trouble to your door. You were in pain, Elira said simply. Nothing else mattered. Aldrich moved closer, his presence filling the small space between them. Nothing else mattered, he repeated. Not my nature, not the risk to. Yourself, not the political implications, simply that I needed healing. It's what healers do, my lord. Is it? His voice carried a note of wonder. In 3 centuries of blood-bonding ceremonies, I have seen women chosen for their beauty, their family connections, their ability to bear strong offspring. Never have I seen one chosen for her capacity for compassion. Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks. The young women chosen tonight are all worthy, my lord. They have been prepared for their roles since childhood. Prepared? Yes, but prepared for what? To look beautiful in ceremonial gowns? To make politically advantageous matches? He paused, studying her face. When did you last hear of a blood bond that created genuine partnership rather than mere alliance? The question struck uncomfortably close to truths Elira had observed but never voiced. She'd helped deliver babies to vampire-bonded women, had tended their bruises and tears when their immortal husbands proved cold or cruel. The bonds ensured peace between their peoples, but they rarely ensured happiness for the women involved. That is not my place to judge, my lord. Perhaps it should be. Aldrich moved to her window, gazing out at the village where chaos likely still reigned in the great hall. Tonight I postponed the ceremony. Elira's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. You postponed it, but the ceremony hasn't been delayed in 300 years. No, it hasn't, and perhaps that's part of the problem. He turned back to her, silver scar catching the candlelight. I postponed it because the most worthy woman in Thornvale was not among the candidates. The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water. Elira stared at him, certain she'd misheard. My lord, I think you misunderstand. I'm not. I could never what? Show compassion to a stranger? Risk your safety to help someone in need? Dedicate your life to healing others? His voice gentled. What exactly do you think disqualifies you from being worthy of honor? Mrs. Henwick shifted in her chair, murmuring softly in her sleep. Elira moved to check on her patient, grateful for the excuse to turn away from Aldrich's penetrating gaze. The old woman's breathing remained steady, her color better than it had been earlier. She trusts you, Aldrich observed, watching Elira adjust Mrs. Henwick's blanket. I've cared for her for years. When her husband died, when her arthritis worsened, through 3 bouts of winter fever, Elira smoothed the blanket with gentle hands. She has no family left. I'm all she has. And what do you have? The question caught her off guard. I have my work, my garden, the people who need me. But who takes care of you, Elira Ashwood? The use of her name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. In his deep voice it sounded different, not the casual address of a villager seeking remedies, but something more deliberate, more intimate. I take care of myself, my lord. I have for years. Perhaps, Aldrich said quietly, it's time someone took care of you for a change. 3 days had passed since the postponed ceremony, and Thornvale buzzed with speculation like a hive of disturbed bees. Elira went about her daily routines, tending her garden, mixing remedies, visiting the sick, but she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that stopped whenever she drew near. The evening brought another soft knock at her door. This time, Elira wasn't surprised to see Aldrich standing on her threshold, though her heart still quickened at his presence. He carried himself differently tonight, less like a king making a royal visit and more like a man seeking refuge from the demands of his station. "Mrs. Henwick has recovered well," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "She's back home now, though I check on her twice daily." "And how are you?" Aldrich asked, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her look away. "Well enough." Elira moved to her herb cabinet, retrieving a small leather pouch. "I've been working on a new blend for joint pain. The elderly suffer terribly when the mountain air grows cold." She opened the pouch, revealing seeds unlike any Aldrich had seen before. They gleamed like tiny pearls in the lamplight, each one perfectly formed and radiating a subtle warmth. "Healing garden seeds," she explained, noticing his interest. "My grandmother brought them from the old country. They grow only in soil that has been blessed by generations of healers." She rolled one between her fingers, her voice growing softer. "I've been cultivating them for 40 years, perfecting their properties." 40 years of work," Aldrich said quietly, and the village council deemed such dedication unworthy of recognition. Elira's hands stilled. "You speak often of worth, my lord. What brings such thoughts to an immortal king?" Instead of answering directly, Aldrich moved to her small window, gazing out at the village below. "I have ruled for 6 centuries, Elira. In that time, I have seen countless blood-bonding ceremonies, formed alliances with families whose names I barely remember, shared ritual wine with women who feared me more than they respected me." He turned back to her, and she was surprised to see something almost vulnerable in his ancient eyes. "When did you last feel truly known by another person?" The question struck her unexpectedly. Elira set down the seeds, her mind turning to the years since Thomas's death. "I suppose it's been some time," she admitted. "The villagers know me for what I do, but few care about who I am beneath the role of healer." "Precisely." Aldrich stepped closer, his presence warming the small space between them. "Tonight I sat through another council meeting where vampire lords discussed the postponed ceremony as if it were merely a business transaction. They asked when I would choose from the 7 candidates, as if connection could be commanded and compatibility measured in bloodlines and dowries. Elira poured tea for both of them, her movements automatic but her mind racing. "Perhaps that's simply how such things must be arranged, my lord. Immortal alliances require different considerations than mortal marriages." "Do they? Or have we simply convinced ourselves they do because it's easier than seeking genuine partnership?" Aldrich accepted the cup she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. "When you tended my wounds all those years ago, did you see a vampire lord or simply a being in need of healing?" "I saw someone who was hurt," Elira said honestly. "Your nature mattered less than your need. And when I look at you now, I see someone whose worth has nothing to do with age or conventional beauty." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I see wisdom earned through decades of service, compassion that asks for nothing in return, and a strength that has weathered losses that would break lesser souls." Heat bloomed in Elira's cheeks, and she turned away under the pretext of checking her herb inventory. "You speak kindly, my lord, but you don't believe it." Aldrich set down his cup and moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the coolness that emanated from his immortal form. "How long has it been since someone told you that you matter, Elira? Not for what you do, but for who you are?" Before she could answer, rapid footsteps approached her cottage. Young Sarah Millwright burst through the door without knocking, her face streaked with tears and her wedding gown torn at the sleeve. "Elira, please," Sarah gasped. "I need your help." Elira immediately shifted into healer mode, guiding the distressed young woman to a chair. Sarah was one of the 7 chosen for the blood bonding, paired with Lord Kieran of the Eastern House. "What's happened, dear?" Elira asked, dampening a cloth to clean the dirt from Sarah's face. "Lord Kieran," Sarah sobbed. "He's cruel, Elira. He told me I belong to him now, that I should be grateful he chose me from among the candidates. When I asked about returning to visit my family, he laughed and said I was property now, not a person." Aldrich stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Where is Lord Kieran now?" Sarah looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, only now realizing she'd interrupted a private conversation with the Alpha King. "In the great hall, my lord, drinking with the other lords and boasting about his new acquisition." "Your acquisition," Aldrich repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "He used that word?" Sarah nodded miserably. "He said the blood bonding was a purchase agreement, not a marriage, that I should learn my place quickly if I wanted to avoid punishment." Elira felt anger rise in her chest like a physical heat. She'd delivered Sarah, had watched her grow from a bright child into a thoughtful young woman who deserved so much better than to be treated as chattel. "There must be some mistake," Elira said gently, though her eyes flashed with fury. "Surely the bonds are meant to be partnerships." "Are they?" Aldrich's voice cut through her hopeful words. "When did we last examine what these ceremonies actually create versus what they claim to represent?" He knelt beside Sarah's chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "You have my word that you will not be forced into any arrangement that treats you as property. The blood bonding is meant to create alliances built on mutual respect, not ownership." "But the contracts have been signed," Sarah whispered. "My father received payment for my participation. I'm legally bound to Lord Kieran now." "Contracts can be nullified," Aldrich said firmly, "especially when they violate the spirit of the original covenant." He stood and turned to Elira. The blood bonding ritual was created to forge connections based on compatibility and mutual regard. Somewhere along the way, it became a marketplace for trading women like livestock. Elira looked between Sarah's tear-stained face and Aldrich's grim expression, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. "You're going to change things, aren't you?" "We're going to change things," Aldrich corrected. "But first, we need to understand what the ritual was meant to be before it became corrupted by greed and politics." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "Sarah, you'll stay here tonight, under Elira's protection. Tomorrow, we'll address Lord Kieran's behavior and examine the true purpose of blood bonding." After he left, Elira prepared a calming tea for Sarah, while her mind raced with possibilities. For the first time in decades, she felt the stirring of something she'd thought long dead, hope that perhaps worth and wisdom might matter more than youth and political advantage. "Elira," Sarah said quietly, "do you think things can really change?" Looking out at the night where Aldrich had disappeared into the shadows, Elira felt a smile tug at her lips. "I think, dear one, that change has already begun." Dawn brought no peace to Thornvale. Word of Sarah Millwright's flight from her bonded lord had spread through the village like wildfire, and the great hall buzzed with heated arguments between the vampire delegation and the village council. Elira could hear raised voices even from her cottage as she prepared Sarah's morning meal. The young woman had slept fitfully, waking several times with nightmares about Lord Kieran's cold hands and crueler words. Now she sat at Elira's small table, picking at bread and honey, while dark circles shadowed her eyes. "They'll make me go back to him," Sarah said quietly. "My father signed the contracts. The dowry has been paid." "Lord Aldrich gave you his protection," Elira reminded her, though she too worried about the political forces arrayed against one frightened young woman. "He won't allow you to be treated as property." A knock at the door. interrupted their conversation. Elira opened it to find Aldrich standing on her threshold, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two other figures, Lord Matthias, a younger vampire with kind eyes, and Elena Hartwell, the mayor's own daughter who had been chosen for the ceremony. "May we come in?" Aldrich asked. "There are things that need discussion." Elira stepped aside, her cottage suddenly feeling very small with so many occupants. Elena moved immediately to Sarah's side, taking her hands in a gesture of comfort that spoke of deep friendship. "Elena has chosen not to bond with her assigned partner," Aldrich announced without preamble. "She and Lord Matthias have formed a genuine attachment, but their pairing violates the predetermined arrangements." Elena lifted her chin with quiet defiance. "Lord Blackwood is a good man, but we have nothing in common. He speaks to me as if I were a child to be managed rather than a woman to be known. Matthias and I have spent hours in conversation these past 3 days. We share interests, values, hopes for the future. And Lord Blackwood," Elira asked, "threatens to invoke the old laws," Matthias said grimly. "He claims breach of contract and demands either Elena's compliance or financial compensation from her family." Aldrich moved to Elira's window, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Two women have now discovered that the blood-bonding ceremony has become a system for trading human lives rather than forging genuine partnerships. The question becomes, how many others are suffering in silence? "The village council is meeting this afternoon," Elena said. "My father is under tremendous pressure to force my compliance. The other vampire lords are questioning your authority to interfere with established contracts." Elira busied herself preparing tea for her unexpected guests, her mind working through the implications. The blood-bonding ceremony was the foundation of peace between their peoples, but if it had become corrupted, what did that mean for the future? As she arranged cups on a tray, something caught her eye on her windowsill. Where yesterday there had been only common herbs, now a single, extraordinary bloom nestled among the ordinary plants. The night-blooming rose was unlike anything in her garden. Its petals were deep purple, edged with silver, and it seemed to glow with its own inner light even in the daylight. "The night-blooming rose," Aldrich said softly, noticing her surprise. "It opens only in moonlight, for those who understand that true beauty reveals itself to patient eyes." Elira touched one of the silvery petals, feeling a warmth that spoke of magic older than the village itself. "It's beautiful. But how did it come to be in my garden?" "Perhaps it belongs where it can be properly appreciated," Aldrich said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. Elena cleared her throat gently, drawing attention back to their current crisis. "The council wants to know what you propose to do about the disrupted ceremonies, my lord. Some are calling for immediate enforcement of the existing contracts, and some are calling for my removal as Alpha King," Aldrich admitted. "My own court questions my judgment in postponing the ritual and interfering with established law." "Then, perhaps," Elira said quietly, "it's time to remind everyone what the law was originally meant to accomplish." All eyes turned to her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at being the center of attention. But Sarah and Elena were depending on her wisdom, and Aldrich looked at her with an expectation that strengthened her resolve. The blood bonding was created to forge genuine alliances, was it not? To create partnerships that would benefit both peoples. She moved to her herb shelves, retrieving her grandmother's journal. "My grandmother kept records of the early ceremonies. She wrote that the first bonds were between individuals who chose each other based on compatibility and mutual respect." She opened the worn journal, finding the passage she remembered. "Here, the ritual succeeds only when both parties enter willingly, seeking partnership rather than advantage. A bond forced is a bond broken, bringing sorrow to both houses involved." "Your grandmother witnessed the early ceremonies?" Matthias asked. "She was present at the very first one," Elira said, pride warming her voice. She was the village's healer then, responsible for blessing the unions and ensuring both parties were entering with clear hearts and honest intentions. Aldrich stepped closer, studying the journal's pages. What happened to that tradition? Why aren't the village healers involved in the modern ceremonies? The role was diminished over time, Elira said carefully. As the political importance of the ceremonies grew, the spiritual aspects were set aside. Healers were considered too common to participate in such grand affairs. Too common, Aldrich repeated, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. Yet they were the ones who understood the true purpose of the bonding. Elena leaned forward eagerly. Could the old ways be restored? Could we have ceremonies based on choice rather than contract? Before anyone could answer, shouting erupted from the village square. Through the window, they could see Councilwoman Briggs marching toward the cottage with half a dozen village men behind her. "They're coming for Sarah," Elena whispered. Aldrich moved to the door, his presence shifting from conversational to commanding in an instant. "Let them come, but they'll find that some contracts aren't worth the parchment they're written on." Elira closed her grandmother's journal, holding it protectively against her chest. The knowledge it contained could reshape everything about the blood bonding ceremony if they survived the next few minutes. "Elira," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "what if this makes things worse for you? You could lose everything by helping us." Looking at the young woman's frightened face, then at Elena's determined expression, and finally at Aldrich's fierce protectiveness, Elira realized she'd already made her choice. "Some things are worth losing everything for," she said simply, starting with the right of every woman to be treated as a person, not a possession. The shouting grew closer, and through her window, Elira could see Councilwoman Briggs's face twisted with righteous anger. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back from this moment. But as she looked at the night-blooming rose on her windowsill, a gift that spoke of seeing beyond surface appearances to hidden beauty, Elira felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Councilwoman Briggs burst through Elira's door without invitation, her face flushed with indignation and her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This has gone quite far enough. Sarah Millwright, you will return to your bonded lord immediately, and Elena, your father is beside himself with worry." Behind her, Mayor Hartwell wrung his hands nervously while several village men shuffled their feet, clearly uncomfortable with confronting the Alpha Vampire King, but bound by their loyalty to the council's authority. "Good afternoon, Councilwoman Briggs," Elira said with calm dignity, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Don't play innocent with me, healer," Briggs snapped. "You're harboring fugitives from lawful contracts. This interference ends now." Aldrich stepped forward, his presence filling the small cottage like gathering storm clouds. "Councilwoman, I believe you're confused about whose authority supersedes whose in matters of blood bonding." "My lord," Briggs said, her tone shifting to forced respect while maintaining her underlying hostility, "surely you understand the importance of honoring signed agreements. The stability of our alliance depends on it. Does it?" Aldrich's voice carried centuries of command. "Or does stability depend on ensuring those agreements serve their intended purpose rather than corrupting it?" From her position near the window, Elira could see more people gathering in the street. Word was spreading quickly that a confrontation was brewing between the village council and the vampire delegation. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed the kind of eager anticipation that fed on conflict. "Sarah," Mayor Hartwell said, addressing his daughter's friend directly, "Lord Kieran has agreed to forgive this temporary rebellion if you return willingly. He's prepared to overlook your behavior and proceed with the bonding." "Overlook my behavior?" Sarah's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and outrage. "What about overlooking his behavior? He told me I was property to be owned, not a person to be partnered with." Elena moved protectively closer to her friend. Father, you can't seriously expect Sarah to accept such treatment. Would you want that for me? Mayor Hartwell's face crumpled with the weight of impossible choices. Elena, dear, these are political matters beyond our personal preferences. The contracts are invalid, Matthias interrupted firmly. I've spent the morning researching the original covenant that established blood bonding ceremonies. The agreements were never meant to transfer ownership of human women to vampire lords. They were intended to create partnerships based on mutual consent and compatibility. Councilwoman Briggs's eyes narrowed dangerously. Young vampire lord, you speak of documents none of us have seen. How convenient that you claim authority based on papers that may not even exist. Elira felt the moment crystallize around her grandmother's journal, still clutched against her chest. The knowledge contained within those worn pages could either vindicate their position or expose them to charges of fabricating evidence. But looking at Sarah's frightened face and Elena's determined expression, she knew the choice was already made. The documents exist, she said quietly, drawing all attention to herself. My grandmother kept detailed records of the early ceremonies, including the original covenant terms. She opened the journal with hands that trembled only slightly, finding the passage that could change everything. The blood-bonding covenant of the First Alliance, signed by Alpha King Aldrich and village elder Thornvale 3 centuries past. This agreement establishes sacred partnership between willing individuals of both peoples, based upon mutual respect, compatible spirits, and shared commitment to the welfare of their communities. No bond shall be forced upon unwilling participants, and no person shall be treated as chattel in the name of alliance. The silence that followed was deafening. Councilwoman Briggs reached for the journal, but Aldrich's hand intercepted hers with gentle but immovable authority. I remember signing that covenant, he said softly, his ancient eyes distant with memory. Village elder Thornvale insisted on those specific words. She said that any alliance built on coercion would ultimately fail. Village elder Thornvale, Elira whispered, sudden understanding blooming in her chest. That was my great-grandmother's name. Lydia Thornvale. Aldrich's gaze snapped to her face, recognition dawning. Lydia Thornvale was your ancestor? She founded the village, Elira said, pieces of family history clicking into place. She was the first healer, the one who established the traditions we've followed for generations. The village was named for her. Mayor Hartwell's face had gone pale. That would make you the rightful keeper of the covenant, Aldrich finished, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Your bloodline connects directly to the original architect of the blood-bonding ritual. Councilwoman Briggs sputtered with indignation. This preposterous. Even if these claims are true, they don't change the fact that legal contracts have been signed and payment accepted. Payment for what? Elena asked sharply. For the right to own women like livestock? That was never the intended purpose. The intended purpose, said a new voice from the doorway, was to create genuine partnerships that would strengthen both our peoples. Everyone turned to see an elderly vampire lord entering the cottage. Lord Theron was ancient even by immortal standards, his white hair gleaming like silver in the afternoon light, and his pale eyes holding memories of centuries past. Lord Theron, Aldrich said respectfully, I didn't expect you to leave the delegation. When I heard discussion of the original covenant, I felt compelled to contribute my recollections, Theron said, bowing slightly to Elira. I was present at those first ceremonies, young healer. Your great-grandmother was indeed instrumental in establishing the terms that have supposedly governed our alliance. Supposedly, Councilwoman Briggs's voice cracked with strain. The ceremonies I've witnessed in recent decades bear little resemblance to the partnerships your ancestor envisioned, Theron continued. Somewhere along the way, we allowed political expedience to corrupt spiritual purpose. He moved to the memory stone that sat among Elira's herb jars, an ancient crystal she'd inherited from her grandmother without fully understanding its question. Significance. As his aged hand touched its surface, the crystal began to glow with soft blue light. This stone holds the true history, Theron explained. It records not just events, but the intentions behind them. Touch it, child of Thornvale, and see what your ancestor truly intended. Elira approached the glowing crystal with trembling steps. When her fingers made contact with its surface, images flooded her mind. Her great-grandmother working alongside the Alpha King to create ceremonies based on choice rather than obligation, partnerships that honored both people's dignity, bonds that were blessed rather than bought. When the visions faded, Elira found herself surrounded by faces, watching her with expressions ranging from hope to fear to desperate calculation. The original blood-bonding ritual, she said with newfound authority, was about wisdom and compatibility, not youth and beauty. It was about spiritual connection, not political transaction. And it was overseen by healers who could sense true compatibility between souls. The cottage fell silent, except for the sound of breathing and the distant murmur of the growing crowd outside. Councilwoman Briggs straightened her shoulders, preparing for one final assault. Even if all this is true, even if the ceremonies have strayed from original intent, we cannot simply ignore legally binding contracts without consequences. No, Aldrich agreed quietly. We cannot ignore them, but we can examine whether they violate the foundational covenant upon which all subsequent agreements were based. He looked at Elira with an expression that transformed her from village healer to something far more significant. The question is whether the rightful keeper of the covenant is prepared to restore its original purpose. The tension in Elira's cottage stretched taut as a bowstring until it was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the measured cadence of a single rider, but the thunderous rhythm of many horses moving in formation. Through the window, Elira could see a new delegation cresting the hill that led to Thornvale, their dark banners snapping in the mountain wind. The Eastern clan, Lord Theron said grimly, his ancient face creasing with concern. Lord Kieran's reinforcements have arrived. Aldrich moved to the window, his jaw tightening as he counted the riders. 20 strong. They've brought enough force to ensure compliance with their interpretation of the contracts. Or, said a cold voice from the doorway, to enforce the original agreements that some seem eager to abandon. Lord Kieran stepped into the cottage without invitation, his pale eyes scanning the assembled group with predatory interest. Sarah shrank back against Elena, while Councilwoman Briggs straightened with vindicated satisfaction. Lord Kieran, Aldrich said coolly, I don't recall inviting the Eastern clan to interfere in Thornvale's internal affairs. Internal affairs? Kieran's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. When contracted goods are withheld, it becomes a matter of clan honor. I've come to collect what belongs to me. I belong to no one, Sarah said, finding her voice despite her fear. Kieran's gaze fixed on her with the focus of a wolf marking prey. Your father's signature on the bonding contract suggests otherwise, as does the dowry my clan has already paid. He reached into his coat and withdrew a scroll sealed with black wax. Perhaps this will clarify matters. As he unrolled the document, Elira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The parchment was older than it should be, its edges yellowed with age that spoke of decades rather than days. What is that? Elena asked, though something in her voice suggested she already dreaded the answer. The true blood-bonding covenant, Kieran announced, with triumphant malice. Not the romantic fiction your grandmother recorded, healer, but the actual agreement that established our alliance. Lord Theron moved closer to examine the document, his expression growing troubled. This parchment bears the proper seals and signatures, but the terms are quite clear, Kieran continued. In exchange for protection from rival clans and guaranteed tribute, Thornvale agrees to provide 7 suitable women annually to serve as bonded companions to vampire lords. The women become property of their assigned lords, with all rights and privileges transferring upon completion of the ceremony. That's Not possible, Elira said, though doubt crept into her voice like poison. My great-grandmother would never have agreed to such terms. Wouldn't she? Kieran's smile was cruel and knowing. Even to save her village from destruction? Even to prevent the slaughter of every man, woman and child in Thornvale? He gestured to one of his men, who brought forward an ornate wooden box. From within, Kieran withdrew another document, this one bearing the distinctive script that Elira recognized from her grandmother's journal. The surrender terms, signed by Lydia Thornvale herself when the Eastern Clan's army surrounded this village 3 centuries ago, Kieran said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Your ancestor faced a choice: sacrifice 7 daughters annually to ensure the village's survival, or watch everyone she'd sworn to protect die screaming. The document was authentic. Elira could see that immediately. The handwriting matched samples in her grandmother's journal, and the seal bore the Thornvale family crest that had been passed down through generations. She saved them all, Kieran continued, by agreeing that Thornvale would provide tribute in the form of bonded women, a price paid willingly to prevent genocide. But the memory stone, Elira protested weakly. The visions showed ceremonies of choice and partnership. The memory stone shows what the viewer most wishes to see, Kieran said dismissively. Your romantic heart saw love where there was only commerce. The truth is far simpler. Your ancestor sold her village's daughters to save their lives. Silence fell over the cottage like a shroud. Sarah's face had gone white with horror, while Elena stared at the documents as if they might transform into something less damning through force of will. Even if this is true, Aldrich said slowly, circumstances have changed. The threat that forced your ancestor's hand no longer exists, doesn't it? Kieran moved to the window, gesturing toward his assembled forces. The Eastern Clan has honored its part of the bargain for 3 centuries. We've protected this village from raiders, rival vampire factions, and the kind of warfare that destroyed other settlements. In return, we've received what was promised: bonded companions chosen according to our preferences. Slaves, you mean, Elena said with quiet fury. Call them what you will, Kieran shrugged. The contract terms are clear and have been fulfilled faithfully until this recent disruption. He turned to face Elira directly, his pale eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. Did you really think you were excluded from the ceremonies because of age or appearance? You were excluded, dear healer, because you're far too valuable to be wasted on a vampire lord who might fail to appreciate your true worth. What do you mean? Elira asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Kieran reached into the wooden box again, this time withdrawing a scroll that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. The bloodline scroll was unlike any document she'd ever seen. Its parchment appeared to be made from something other than animal skin, and the ink seemed to shift and move as she watched. Your bloodline, traced back through 27 generations, Kieran explained. Your great-grandmother didn't just sign a surrender treaty. She bound her descendants to serve as keepers of the covenant, ensuring that the blood-bonding ceremonies would continue as long as her family line endured. He unrolled the scroll, revealing names written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. At the bottom of the long list, Elira could see her own name, written in script she'd never seen before. The keeper of the covenant cannot be bonded to a single lord, Kieran continued. Her power must remain available to all clans, ensuring that the ceremonies continue to serve their intended purpose. You weren't excluded from the rituals, Elira Ashwood. You were reserved for them. Reserved for what? Aldrich's voice carried dangerous undertones. For the great binding, Kieran said, his triumph complete. When the keeper reaches the proper age and demonstrates sufficient power, she becomes bonded not to a single lord, but to the covenant itself. Her blood becomes the seal that ensures the agreements can never be broken. The implications hit Elira like a physical blow. You're saying I'm meant to become the living embodiment of the covenant, Kieran finished. Your ancestors' blood magic ensures that as long as you live and remain bound to the agreement, no force on earth can break the contracts that protect this village. And if she refuses? Sarah asked, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. Kieran's smile was the coldest thing in the room. Then the original threat returns. The protection ends. And Thornvale faces the same choice your ancestor did 3 centuries ago. Surrender your daughters willingly, or watch everyone die. He gestured toward the window, where his forces waited in formation. I've brought enough soldiers to ensure compliance, one way or another. The only question is whether the great healer will honor her family's legacy or force us to implement less pleasant alternatives. The cottage fell silent except for the sound of labored breathing and racing hearts. Outside, Elira could hear the murmur of villagers gathering to watch the confrontation, unaware that their very survival hung in the balance. "How long do we have to decide?" Aldrich asked, his voice carefully controlled. "The ceremony takes place at moonrise tomorrow night," Kieran announced. "The great binding requires specific celestial alignments that won't occur again for another century. Miss this opportunity, and the covenant becomes void permanently." He rolled up the documents with theatrical precision. "I suggest you spend the remaining time wisely. Say goodbye to your quiet life of herbs and healing. Elira, Ashwood. Tomorrow night, you become something far more significant and far more constrained." As Kieran strode from the cottage, his footsteps echoing like death knells, Elira sank into her chair with the weight of destiny crushing down upon her shoulders. Everything she'd believed about her exclusion from the ceremonies had been wrong. She hadn't been forgotten, she'd been saved for something infinitely worse. The hours following Kieran's revelation passed in a haze of desperate planning and growing dread. As night deepened over Thornvale, Elira's cottage became a war council where the fate of 2 peoples would be decided by sunrise. The sacred binding cords lay spread across her kitchen table, ancient ropes woven with silver threads, and blessed herbs that her grandmother had hidden away for 3 centuries, waiting for the moment when the true blood bonding ritual would need to be performed. "There has to be another way," Sarah said for the 1000th time, her young face etched with guilt. "I can't let you sacrifice yourself for my freedom." "It's not about your freedom anymore," Elena replied quietly, studying the documents that Kieran had left behind. "It's about the freedom of every woman in Thornvale for generations to come." Aldrich stood by the window, his ancient eyes tracking the movements of Kieran's forces as they established camp around the village perimeter. 20 vampire soldiers and twice as many human mercenaries created a net that would be impossible to break through conventional means. "Lord Theron," he said without turning from his vigil, "you've remained quiet about Kieran's claims. What aren't you telling us?" The elderly vampire lord shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pale hands clasped tightly around a cup of Elira's calming tea. "The great binding is real, my lord. I was present when the covenant was first established, though I was young then and didn't fully understand what was being agreed to." "Explain," Aldrich commanded. "Lydia Thornvale possessed a rare gift," Theron began, his voice heavy with memory. "Blood magic that could create unbreakable bonds between willing participants. When the Eastern clan threatened to destroy Thornvale, she offered to use her power to ensure lasting peace, but only if the agreements were based on genuine partnership rather than ownership." Elira looked up from the binding cords, hope flickering in her chest. "So the original ceremony was about choice and compatibility?" "It was," Theron confirmed. "But Kieran's ancestor, Lord Bane, corrupted the agreement. He threatened to kill Lydia's children unless she modified the magic to ensure vampire dominance over human participants. Faced with the murder of her family, she agreed to create the covenant that has bound your bloodline ever since." "Blood magic requires a willing participant," Matthias said, his scholarly mind working through the implications. Elira can't be forced into the great binding if she truly refuses. Can't she? Theron's expression was grim. The covenant includes clauses that make refusal effectively impossible. If Elira doesn't submit willingly, the protection magic fails, and every vampire clan in the region will descend on Thornvale like wolves on a wounded deer. How many people would die? Elena asked quietly. All of them, Theron said simply. The village would cease to exist. The weight of 3,000 lives settled on Elira's shoulders like a mountain. Every person she'd ever healed, every child she'd delivered, every elder she'd comforted in their final moments, all of them would die if she chose personal freedom over collective survival. What if we could restore the original ceremony? She asked, her fingers tracing the silver threads woven through the binding cords. What if instead of the great binding, we performed the blood bonding ritual as my great-grandmother initially intended? Aldrich turned from the window, his dark eyes focusing on her with laser intensity. Explain. The true blood bonding was never about ownership, Elira said, her voice gaining strength as understanding dawned. It was about creating genuine partnerships that would benefit both peoples. What if we could demonstrate that such partnerships are not only possible but superior to the current system? One successful partnership wouldn't be enough to break a covenant sealed with blood magic, Matthias pointed out. No, Elira agreed, but it might be enough to challenge its legitimacy. If we could prove that the original ceremony creates stronger, more beneficial bonds than forced contracts, we could argue that Kieran's interpretation violates the true spirit of the agreement. That's a significant gamble, Elena said. You're betting everything on the hope that a single ceremony can overturn 3 centuries of precedent. Not everything, Aldrich said quietly, his gaze never leaving Elira's face. She's betting on the possibility that genuine partnership might be more powerful than enforced servitude. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mayor Hartwell entered, his face haggard with the weight of impossible decisions. Behind him came a delegation of village elders, their expressions ranging from hopeful to terrified. Elira, Mayor Hartwell said, his voice cracking with strain, the council has met in emergency session. We've come to ask what you've decided. You mean you've come to pressure her into compliance? Elena said sharply. We've come to offer our support, corrected Elder Morrison, a weathered man whose granddaughter was among the 7 chosen for this year's ceremony. Whatever path you choose, healer, you won't walk it alone. The villagers are gathering in the square, Mayor Hartwell continued. They want to know what's happening, why armed soldiers have surrounded our home. Some are calling for surrender to preserve peace, others demand we fight regardless of the cost. Elira looked around her cottage at the herbs that had been her life's work, at the binding cords that represented ancient magic, at the faces of people who depended on her wisdom. The night-blooming rose on her windowsill had opened fully, its petals glowing silver in the moonlight like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. How long until moonrise? She asked. 3 hours, Theron replied. Elira stood, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came only in moments of absolute necessity. Then we have 3 hours to prepare for the true blood bonding ceremony. Elira, Aldrich said carefully, are you certain? Once the ritual begins, there's no stopping it. If we're wrong about the original magic, if we're wrong, I become bound to a system that treats women as property, Elira interrupted. If we're right, we might create something that honors the best intentions of both our peoples. She picked up one of the binding cords, feeling the power that hummed through the silver threads. I've spent my entire life healing others. Perhaps it's time to heal the wounds between our peoples as well. The ceremony requires specific preparations, Theron warned. Sacred circles, blessed wine, witnesses from both communities, and a willing partnership between equals, Elira added, her eyes meeting Aldrich's across the room. The original ritual was designed to join two souls who chose each other freely, whose compatibility had been tested and proven true. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Everyone in the room understood what she was suggesting, but none dared speak it aloud. Finally, Aldrich moved from the window to stand directly in front of her. "Elira Ashwood," he said, his voice carrying the formality of ancient ritual, "will you enter into blood-bonding partnership with me, not as king to subject, but as equals seeking to restore what was lost?" "I will," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "But not as healer to vampire lord, as woman to man, as someone who has seen your heart and chosen to trust it. The Eastern clan will never accept such a union," Mayor Hartwell warned. "They'll claim it violates the covenant terms." "Then we'll prove them wrong," Elena said firmly. "If the original magic was stronger than the corrupted version, it should be able to overcome Kieran's claims." "And if it isn't?" Sarah asked quietly. Elira looked around the room at faces that had become dear to her friends, who had stood by her when the world tried to make her invisible. A vampire lord who had seen worth where others saw only age and plainness. Young women whose futures hung in the balance of tonight's choices. "Then at least we'll have tried to choose love over fear, partnership over ownership," she said. "Sometimes the attempt matters more than the outcome." Outside, torches began to appear in the village square as the people of Thornvale gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. In the distance, the Eastern clan's camp glowed with the cold light of military preparation, ready to enforce their interpretation of ancient law. But in Elira's cottage, surrounded by the herbs that had defined her life and the binding cords that might reshape her future, something new was beginning. A ceremony that would test whether genuine partnership could triumph over centuries of corruption, whether two people who had chosen each other freely could create magic strong enough to protect those they loved. The moonrise was still hours away, but already the night felt charged with possibility and peril in equal measure. Whatever happened next, Thornvale would never be the same. Elira picked up her grandmother's journal, turning to pages that detailed the original blood-bonding ritual. "If we're going to do this," she said, "we're going to do it right. Everyone who wishes to witness the ceremony is welcome, vampire and human alike. Let them see what partnership truly looks like." As the group began preparing for the most important ritual in 3 centuries, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from Kieran's camp and began moving toward the village with deadly purpose. The Eastern clan had not achieved dominance through patience and fair play. They had plans of their own for ensuring the night ended according to their desires. The village square had been transformed into a sacred space unlike anything Thornvale had seen in 3 centuries. Torches formed a perfect circle around the ancient stone altar that had been hidden beneath the fountain for generations, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than wind. At the circle's heart, Elira stood wearing the blood moon crown, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstone that had been retrieved from its hiding place in the village's oldest foundation stone. The crown felt both foreign and familiar against her brow, its weight speaking of responsibilities that stretched back through time to her great-grandmother's desperate bargain. Around her, representatives of both peoples gathered in unprecedented unity. Village elders stood beside vampire lords, young mothers held their children while immortal beings who had lived through centuries watched with ancient eyes. "The true blood bonding begins at the moment of moonrise," Elira announced, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with surprising strength. "Unlike the corrupted ceremonies of recent years, this ritual is entered freely by both participants, blessed by both communities, and sealed with magic that honors the best in both our natures." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. In the shadows at the square's edge, Kieran's forces waited with predatory patience. They had not interfered with the preparations, but their presence served as a constant reminder that failure meant death for everyone present. Aldrich stepped forward to join Elira at the altar, and she was struck again by how right this felt, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. He wore simple black clothing rather than royal regalia, emphasizing that he came to this ceremony not as a king claiming tribute, but as a man choosing partnership. Before we begin, Aldrich addressed the crowd. Let all present understand what we attempt. This is not politics disguised as ritual. This is not alliance purchased with human lives. This is two souls choosing to bind themselves together for the benefit of both our peoples. Pretty words, came Kieran's voice from the crowd's edge as he stepped into the torchlight. But they change nothing about the covenant that binds this village to our protection. Proceed with your romantic theatre if you wish, but when moonrise passes without the great binding, the Eastern clan's patience ends. Behind him, his soldiers shifted with the subtle movements of predators preparing to strike. Several villagers stepped instinctively backward, but Elder Morrison stood his ground. "You'll witness the ceremony in peace," the old man said firmly, "or you'll leave our village now." Kieran's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Your village exists at our sufferance, old man. Do not forget that, when morning comes and you're burying your dead." "Enough!" Elira's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lord Kieran, you claim authority through the covenant your ancestor corrupted. Tonight, we restore that covenant to its original purpose. If our magic proves stronger than yours, your claims become void. And if it proves weaker?" Elira's hand moved to the unity chalice that sat on the altar, the moonstone vessel that had been cracked for decades, but now gleamed whole and perfect in the torchlight. Through blood magic and careful restoration, the symbolic vessel had been repaired, ready to hold the blessed wine that would seal their union. "If it proves weaker, then I submit to the great binding as written," she said simply. "But you'll allow this ceremony to proceed without interference." Kieran studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Agreed. But when your pretty ritual fails, and the moon sets on broken promises, remember that you chose this path freely." The moon began to show above the mountain peaks, its silver light mixing with the golden glow of torches to create an otherworldly atmosphere. Elira felt power gathering in the sacred circle, not the dark energy of coercion that had fueled recent ceremonies, but something cleaner and brighter that spoke of hope rather than fear. "Citizens of Thornvale, lords of the vampire courts," she called out, "witness now the restoration of the true blood bonding, performed as it was meant to be, in love rather than obligation, in partnership rather than ownership, in hope rather than despair." She lifted the unity chalice, now filled with wine that had been blessed by both village, priest and vampire elder. "I, Elira Ashwood, daughter of healers and keeper of ancient wisdom, choose freely to bind my life to Aldrich of the Northern House, not as subject to ruler, but as equal partner in the sacred work of building bridges between our peoples." Aldrich accepted the chalice from her hands, their fingers brushing in a contact that sent warmth through both of them. "I, Aldrich, accept this bond freely given, and offer my own in return, not as king claiming tribute, but as man choosing woman, as immortal soul, recognizing mortal wisdom." The ritual wine glowed as he drank, then passed the chalice back to Elira. As she lifted it to her lips, the first rays of full moonlight struck the sacred circle. That's when everything went wrong. Kieran's soldiers moved with supernatural speed, rushing the circle from all sides. But they weren't attacking the ceremony participants. They were forming a protective barrier around the ritual space, while other figures in Eastern clan colors charged toward the villagers with weapons drawn. "The ceremony is under attack," someone screamed from the crowd. Steel rang against steel as vampire fought vampire in the shadows beyond the torchlight. The true battle had begun, not between mortal and immortal, but between those who sought to preserve corruption and those willing to fight for something better. Elira's hand trembled as she held the chalice, understanding that she had only moments to complete the ritual before chaos consumed everything they'd worked to build. Despite the chaos erupting around them, Elira drank from the unity chalice with steady resolve, the blessed wine burning like liquid fire as it flowed through her veins. The moment the ritual wine touched her lips, power exploded outward from the sacred circle in waves of silver and gold light that illuminated the entire village square. The fighting stopped instantly, as both vampire and human combatants were caught in the expanding energy field. Kieran's soldiers froze mid-strike, their weapons trembling in hands that could no longer command violence. The villagers who had been fleeing in terror found themselves rooted in place, but without fear, the magic washing over them carried only peace and healing. Impossible, Kieran breathed, his pale face stark with disbelief. The original blood magic was broken centuries ago when your ancestor agreed to the modified covenant. But even as he spoke, the truth was becoming undeniable. Elira's heritage power was manifesting in ways that had been hidden for generations, awakening fully now that she had chosen to embrace rather than deny her true nature. The silver threads in her hair began to glow with their own inner light, and the blood moon crown on her brow blazed like captured starlight. The magic was never broken. "Lord," Theron said, wonder filling his ancient voice. It was dormant, waiting for someone worthy to claim their birthright freely, rather than submit to it through coercion. Aldrich stepped closer to Elira, feeling the power that flowed between them like a bridge spanning centuries of mistrust. As their hands joined over the unity chalice, the combined energy of vampire strength and mortal wisdom created something entirely new, not dominance of one over the other, but true partnership that elevated both. "I bind myself to you," Elira said, her voice carrying clearly across the spellbound square, "not in submission but in alliance. I offer my healing gift to strengthen what is good in your people and ask your protection for what is vulnerable in mine." "I accept your gift and offer mine in return," Aldrich replied, his centuries of lonely rule suddenly feeling like preparation for this moment. "I bind myself to you not as master, but as partner. I offer my strength to protect your people's freedom and ask your wisdom to guide mine toward justice." The ritual words were not the ones that had been spoken for 300 years. These were older, cleaner, born from the true intentions of Elira's great-grandmother before corruption had twisted them into instruments of oppression. As they spoke the final binding words together, the unity chalice began to transform. The moonstone vessel, already restored from its cracked state, now transcended its physical form entirely. Light poured from it like liquid starlight, rising in a column that pierced the night sky and could be seen for miles around. "The beacon," whispered someone in the crowd. The ancient texts spoke of a beacon that would shine when the covenant was truly fulfilled. Kieran stumbled backward, his face twisting with rage and desperation. "This changes nothing. The Eastern clan's contracts still stand. Our legal claims—" "Your legal claims," interrupted a new voice from the square's edge, "were based on a corrupted version of the original agreement." A figure stepped into the circle of light, another ancient vampire, but this one bore himself with an authority that made even Kieran step back respectfully. Lord Severin of the High Council, moved with the dignity of one who had witnessed the first blood-bonding ceremonies and remembered what they were meant to accomplish. "Lord Severin," Kieran said carefully, "I wasn't aware the High Council was taking interest in provincial matters." "When beacon light touches the sky for the first time in 3 centuries, it ceases to be a provincial matter," Severin replied coldly. "You have been operating under corrupted documentation, Lord Kieran. The true covenant, as witnessed here tonight, supersedes any contracts based on falsified terms." He gestured toward Elira and Aldrich, who stood together in the blazing column of light that connected earth to sky. Behold the fulfillment of the original blood bonding, not ownership disguised as alliance, but genuine partnership that strengthens both peoples. The power flowing between Elira and Aldrich reached its crescendo, and suddenly every person present could feel the change in the very air around them. The oppressive weight that had hung over Thornvale for generations, the sense that their daughters were commodities to be traded rather than people to be cherished, lifted like morning mist before the sun. The great binding is complete, Elira announced, her voice carrying new authority that came not from conquest, but from willing sacrifice transformed into strength. But not as your ancestors intended, Lord Kieran. This binding protects choice rather than enforcing submission. It guarantees that no woman will ever again be traded like livestock, and no vampire lord will find satisfaction in partnerships built on fear. Kieran's face contorted with fury as he realized his position had become untenable. The beacon light made his corrupted claims impossible to enforce, and the presence of the High Council meant resistance would be tantamount to treason against vampire law itself. "You think you've won," he snarled. "But this changes nothing about power and politics. Pretty magic and romantic gestures don't alter the realities of survival in a dangerous world." "No," Aldrich said quietly, his arm around Elira's waist as they stood together in the fading column of light. "But they alter what we choose to do with that survival. Instead of building strength through oppression, we'll build it through partnership. Instead of maintaining peace through fear, we'll maintain it through justice." The Unity Chalice, now returned to its physical form, gleamed perfect and whole in Elira's hands. The true blood bonding was complete, and with it 3 centuries of corruption had been swept away. 6 months had passed since the night the beacon light transformed Thornvale forever, and autumn had returned to the mountain village with a gentleness that spoke of deeper changes than mere seasonal transition. Elira stood in her expanded garden, now 3 times its original size, watching Sarah Millwright teach a group of young women the proper techniques for harvesting healing herbs. The sight filled her with quiet satisfaction, not just because the herbs would help heal bodies, but because the young women learning to cultivate them would never face the fear of being traded like commodities. The new village charter hung framed in the cottage that had become both home and school, its carefully crafted words ensuring that no person in Thornvale would ever again be excluded from community decisions based on age, appearance, or social standing. More importantly, it established the principle that all bonding ceremonies, whether between vampire and human or human and human, must be based on mutual choice and genuine compatibility. Aunt Elira called young Thomas, Mrs. Henwick's great-nephew, who had come to live with his elderly relative after the changes began. "Lord Aldrich is coming up the path." Elira looked up from the rosemary she'd been pruning to see her bonded partner approaching through the bint. Late afternoon sunshine. Even after 6 months, the sight of him still quickened her pulse, not with the nervous flutter of new attraction, but with the deeper warmth of recognition between souls who had found their proper match. "How did the council meeting proceed?" she asked as he drew near, noting the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested political challenges. "Better than expected," Aldrich replied, settling beside her on the garden bench they'd built together during the spring planting season. "Lord Severin has confirmed that 12 other villages have requested modifications to their own blood bonding ceremonies. The beacon light didn't just change Thornvale, it started a movement." "And Kieran's response to that movement?" Aldrich's expression darkened briefly. "He's withdrawn the Eastern clan to their mountain stronghold and refuses all communication with the High Council. Lord Severin believes he's gathering support among the more traditional vampire houses, but so far his influence remains limited." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching Sarah guide her students through the delicate process of identifying medicinal plants by touch as well as sight. The young woman had transformed over the months, from frightened victim to confident teacher, Her experience with Lord Kieran's cruelty having awakened a fierce determination to ensure other women never faced similar treatment. Elena's wedding preparations are proceeding well, Elira said, changing to a happier subject. She and Matthias have chosen to hold the ceremony here in the village rather than in his family's castle. They want to demonstrate that partnerships can flourish in humble surroundings as well as grand ones. Wise choice. The villagers have grown fond of Matthias, and his willingness to live among mortals, rather than demanding Elena abandon her community, has impressed even the skeptics. Elira smiled, remembering how the scholarly young vampire lord had insisted on learning traditional human crafts so he could contribute meaningfully to village life. His partnership with Elena had become a model for other cross-species relationships, proving that genuine compatibility could bridge even the gap between mortal and immortal. "Missus, Henwick asked me to give you this," Aldrich said, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small wrapped package. "She insisted it was important, but wouldn't tell me what it contained." Elira unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a silver locket that had clearly been treasured for many years. Inside, she found a tiny pressed flower, a night-blooming rose, identical to the one that still graced her windowsill. "Her grandmother's locket," Elira whispered, recognizing the delicate engraving around the edges. "She told me once that her grandmother had been present at one of the original blood-bonding ceremonies before the corruption began." "A note tucked beneath the locket," explained Mrs. "Henwick's gift. For the Distas, woman who restored honor to ancient promises. May your partnership bloom as eternally as the rose that opens its heart to moonlight." "She sees the significance of what we accomplished," Aldrich said gently. "Not just the political changes or the improved ceremonies, but the restoration of hope for partnerships based on genuine connection. Do you ever doubt what we did?" Elira asked, voicing a concern that occasionally surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. "Wonder if we were naive to believe that love and choice could triumph over centuries of established power?" Aldrich considered her question seriously before answering. "I doubt many things about my ability to be the partner you deserve, or to lead wisely in these changing times. But I never doubt that what we created that night was stronger and more valuable than what came before." He took her hand, their bonded connection allowing him to feel the steady warmth of her soul. "Every village that requests ceremony modifications, every young woman who chooses her partner freely, every vampire lord who learns to see humans as equals rather than possessions, they're all evidence that hope was justified." A commotion from the village square drew their attention. Through the garden gate, they could see people gathering around a travel-worn messenger who had just arrived on a lathered horse. Even from a distance, the excitement in the crowd was palpable. "More good news, I hope," Elira said, though part of her remained perpetually braced for word that Kieran had found some way to challenge their newly established peace. Sarah appeared at the garden gate, her face bright with joy. "Elira, Lord Aldrich, you need to hear this. The messenger brings word from the capital. The High Council has officially declared the beacon light ceremony to be the new standard for all blood-bonding rituals throughout the realm. No more forced partnerships. No more women treated as property. The changes we started here are becoming law everywhere." As the young woman hurried back to join the celebration, Elira and Aldrich sat quietly absorbing the magnitude of what had grown from their single act of courage. The small cottage where a forgotten healer had once tended her herbs in solitude had become the birthplace of a transformation that would affect countless lives across generations. "I love you," Aldrich said simply, the words carrying weight earned through months of daily choice to honor partnership over convenience. "And I love you," Elira replied, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light as she leaned into his embrace. "Not for the crown you wear or the power you wield, but for the man who saw worth in a village healer when the world called her invisible." As evening settled over Thornvale, bringing with it the gentle glow of the night-blooming rose that had become their symbol. Two souls who had found each other against all odds sat together in the garden they had built with their own hands, surrounded by the community they had helped to heal, content in the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simple decision to treat each other with dignity and respect. The beacon light no longer needed to shine, its work was complete, and its legacy lived on in every partnership freely chosen, every bond based on genuine connection, and every person who refused to be diminished by others' limited vision of their worth.